snowstorm had just dropped 2 feet of fresh powder along the mountainside. I hadn't bought a pass that year. I prefer backcountry skiing anyway. I didn't mind the climb. In some ways, I loved it as much as the descent. My skis hung over my shoulder as I worked my way up the glade. A skier flew past me at one point, yelling out in excitement as he carved down through untouched snow. I pushed higher until I reached a point that felt right. I set my pack down, snapped into my bindings, and took a moment to look around. I was deep in it now, 8, maybe 900 feet up. I knew what to watch for. Avalanches and tree wells. Confidence keeps you sharp, but arrogance can get you killed. Up here I was alone. The skiers I'd seen earlier hadn't ventured this far. It was just me and the mountain. I dropped in. Visibility deteriorated as I moved lower. The glade widened into a barren stretch. The storm flattened everything into white. Sky and slope seemed to bend into one seamless sheet. Through my fogged goggles, I couldn't tell where ground ended and air began. The fresh powder had softened the terrain, burying natural moguls I didn't see until they bucked me off rhythm. I came to a stop, chest heaving, trying to reset. That's when the sensation started. I was moving, even though I was standing still. At first, I thought it was vertigo, the whiteout playing tricks. I blinked hard, focused on a fixed point ahead, but then I noticed the snow beneath my skis was shifting, not sliding downhill, sinking. My pulse thudded in my throat. I bent my knees immediately and leaned uphill. I drove one pull forward into the snow. It went down without resistance. I pushed harder. The pull kept going. A hollow of powder, as if the mountain were exhaling. The snow in front of me sagged and folded in on itself, drifting downward and vanishing into something black. It wasn't sliding. It was disappearing. It was a crevasse, or at least a snow bridge. My stomach lurched. This is how people die. I tried to shuffle backward carefully, keeping my weight low, but the surface beneath me felt alive, slowly tilting. It was pulling at me. My skis crept forward an inch at a time. I dropped to my hands and knees to distribute my weight and began crawling uphill. The snow moved faster. It felt like walking backward on a treadmill. No matter how hard I pushed, the mountain kept dragging me toward the sagging void ahead. The powder beneath my left ski collapsed another inch. Cold air rose from below. Then the snow gave way completely. It swallowed my skis first, then my knees. I tried to thrust my poles outward, but they tore free from my grip as the surface liquefied beneath me. When the snow reached my thighs, a new fear overtook me. Not the fall, but suffocation, being packed in and buried upright. But instead of stopping, I passed through. The white turned blue. I smashed sideways against ice, felt it before I saw it. I was overtaken by a violent glacial cold. Something warm spread under my jacket. I slid, scraping along the wall. Then the snow chased in after me from above. For a moment, I was crushed between falling weight and frozen stone. Then the snow broke through again, and I dropped. Through another layer. Then nothing. My stomach lurched. This was it. The true fall. I dropped long enough for the silence to register. That strange suspension between impact and realization. And then I hit the bottom. Soft snow. Deep, wind-packed powder that absorbed most of it, but not all. My shoulder took the brunt. I heard the pop before I felt the pain. For a few seconds, I felt nothing. Just shock and the roar of blood in my ears. Endorphins flooded my system, like anesthesia. Then the snow began to fall again. Not powder now, but slabs. Dense chunks breaking loose above and slamming into my back. It was dark and I tried to roll, but my arm wouldn't respond. I clawed forward with my good hand, dragging myself through waist-deep snow. The cascade continued relentlessly. I imagined the shaft sealing shut and light disappearing, air thinning. Was I going to be buried alive? I lunged again, pulling myself toward a darker pocket where the snow wasn't falling as heavily. Finally, the barrage slowed, then stopped. Silence, and above me a narrow slit of pale light. I lay still, gasping, seeing phantom lights from where I hit my head, saved by my helmet. I wasn't clinging to an edge halfway down. I was at the very bottom, 20 feet below the surface, and the mountain had swallowed me whole. I'm not sure how long I remained still. I was afraid to move, afraid even to make much noise, as if any sudden shift might trigger another collapse from above. I sat there with my heart pounding hard enough to feel it in my throat, and my head throbbing in slow pulses. When the pain finally settled into something steady and undeniable, I tested my legs. I stood carefully. That was a relief at least. My shoulder, though, radiated a deep, sickening pain that climbed into the base of my neck. It felt loose and wrong, hanging slightly lower than it should. I knew the sensation immediately. I had dislocated it before. I pulled my phone from my jacket and switched on the flashlight. The battery was still near full. The beam bounced sharply off the ice packed tight around me. Blue walls rose on either side, smooth and close enough that I could reach out and touch both at once. It felt less like a crack in the mountain, and more like being wedged inside its throat. Above me, the sky was a narrow slit of pale light, blurred by falling snow. The storm continued as if nothing had happened. Snow drifted down lazily through the opening, collecting around my boots. I checked for service, though I already knew I would find none. Sure enough, there was no signal, not even a flicker. I forced myself to breathe slowly and shrugged my pack off with difficulty, favoring my good arm. I unzipped it and took inventory. A collapsible shovel, 1 protein bar. My camelback was still half full, but it didn't feel like much anymore. I pressed my gloved hand against the ice, searching for texture, for fractures, or anything I might use as leverage. The walls were polished smooth, carved by pressure and time. There were no ridges, no roots, no exposed rock to grip. Just glassy blue ice rising straight up, toward that distant strip of light. That was when the weight of it truly settled in. If I couldn't climb, and no one knew exactly where I dropped in, then the mountain wouldn't need to do anything else to finish the job. It could simply wait. I was trying to stay calm, forcing myself to take slow breaths and think clearly. But with the pressure mounting and the fear creeping in from every angle, it felt nearly impossible to hold it together. The snow kept falling in uneven drifts. Every so often, maybe an hour, maybe less, I couldn't tell anymore, a fresh clump would shear loose from above and drop into the shaft. Each one sounded heavier than the last. If the storm went on long enough, it might fill the bottom high enough for me to climb out. That thought felt desperate, but it was something to cling to. About 10 feet up, there was a lip where the ice pushed inward, narrowing the shaft slightly. It wasn't much, just a subtle protrusion, but it broke the smooth vertical wall. If I could reach that ledge, if I could get my weight onto it, I'd have a real chance. From there, the opening above looked closer, almost reachable. With the last heap of snow came my second ski. It nearly struck me in the head as it dropped, splitting the silence with a sharp crack, before burying itself upright in the powder beside me. I stared at it for a moment, my mind slow to catch up. The ski was longer than the width of the crevasse. Longer. I reached for it carefully with my good arm and dragged it across the narrow throat of ice. It fit. Barely, but it did. The tip pressed against one wall, the tail against the other. I wedged it there, packing snow over both ends with my glove to keep it from shifting. My collapsible shovel would have made it cleaner, but I didn't trust myself to balance while digging one-handed. I worked slowly, pressing snow down hard until it froze into place. If it held, it would become a horizontal bar above me. It was a start. I fed one of the straps from my pack around the center of the ski and tied it off as tight as I could. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't even secure in the way I would have liked, but it was something to pull against. The first problem was my shoulder. I knew I wouldn't climb one-armed, not 20 feet of ice. I braced my back against one wall and let my injured arm hang loose. I pressed my fist against the ice at shoulder height and leaned into it slowly. The joint screamed. I pushed harder. There was a dull, wet pop, and my vision went white. For a second, I thought I might pass out. Then the pain flooded in, sharper than before, but stable. The arm hung differently now. It was back where it belonged. I flexed my fingers. They moved. That was enough for me. I reached up and grabbed the ski bar with both hands and tried to pull myself upward, pressing my boots against the opposite wall in a chimney stance. My back against one side, feet against the other. I shuffled upward inches at a time. The ice was slick, offering almost no purchase. Every movement cost more strength than it should have. I made it maybe 4 feet before my right boot slipped. My body twisted, and my shoulder flared again. I lost my grip and dropped back into the powder below. The fall wasn't far, but it knocked the breath out of me. When I looked up, the crevasse felt different, narrower. The blue walls seemed closer than before, and the slit of sky thinner. The light above dimmed as another veil of snow passed across it. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the ice appeared to shift subtly. The wall seemed to swell inward and retreat again, like lungs. The blue deepened and lightened in a slow rhythm. I told myself it was exhaustion, shock, and blood loss, but as I stood there, pressed between those frozen walls, it felt as though the mountain was breathing. It made me feel smaller than I ever had, like something lodged in a throat, being swallowed. The thought alone broke whatever calm I had left. I grabbed the ski again, adjusted it higher, packed more snow around the ends, and tightened the strap until my fingers trembled. I planted my boots hard against the walls and pushed upward with everything I had. I didn't move gracefully this time. I scraped, kicked, and clawed. The ice burned through my gloves and tore at my knuckles. I kept my back pressed against one wall and my feet against the other, inching upward by friction alone. The lip 10 feet above seemed impossibly far. Halfway up, my boots slid again. I slammed my knee into the wall and caught myself with my forearms draped over the ski. The strap cut into my glove. I hung there, shaking, staring down into the blue void. I didn't look long. I took a deep breath and reset my feet. I knew if I fell, I wouldn't have the strength to try again. When I finally reached the inward lip of ice, I hooked my elbow over it and hauled myself onto it like dragging dead weight. My chest lay flat against the frozen ledge while my legs dangled below. I stayed there for several seconds, breathing hard, afraid to move in case the mountain changed its mind. The slit of sky was closer now, close enough to see snow swirling across it. I kicked steps into the wall above the lip and shoved myself upward again. My fingers found the edge. My forearm screamed. I pulled. For a moment, my body hung half in and half out of the mountain. Then, with the last of my strength, I rolled onto the surface. The storm swallowed me instantly. Snow stung my face and filled my collar. I crawled several feet away from the fracture before standing. When I turned back, the opening was already softening. Snow drifted into it gently, as if smoothing over a scar. It didn't collapse. There was nothing dramatic like that. It was just erasure. I limped downward, slowly through the waist-high snow. Everything was a blur. By the time I reached the van, it was dark. The lot was empty. There were no headlights or engines, just the sound of wind moving across the ridge. It felt like I had been gone for days. We were in the North Cascades, hiking around 9,000 feet. We top out near 11 before making camp for the night. The plan was to settle on a high saddle, where the views would be staggering if the weather held. We'd never hiked this particular trail before, but the photos we'd seen were enough to convince us. It was Chuck, Amy, and me. We try to do a handful of trips like this every year, and each one ends up different somehow. Different terrain or weather, a different kind of memory, but always something that stays with you. The entire day had been clear. Not just blue skies, but the kind of clarity that makes the peaks look closer than they are. The heat built steadily as we climbed, rising toward a slow crescendo by sunset. By the time we reached the rocky outcropping where we'd make camp, the light had turned copper, and the air felt thick against the skin. A lone tree clung to the saddle, twisted and wind-beaten. It looked old and brittle. I wouldn't have trusted it to hold a hammock, but it had shed enough dry branches to give us fuel for a fire. Below us, a massive lake filled the valley. The basin had been soaked in rain for nearly 3 weeks before this window of clear weather. The shoreline was swollen, the water dark and reflective in the distance. We were grateful the skies had finally broken for us. The air was heavy with lingering moisture. Even at elevation, it felt dense. There was a stillness to everything. No wind scraping across the ridge. All was quiet. It was the kind of calm that feels peaceful at first, until the silence fills the ears and becomes unsettling. Our plan was to break camp early the next morning, push to the summit, then descend into the valley on the other side before moving on to the next 14er. It turned cold quickly as we sat by the fire. Not a sharp wind or a front rolling in, but something more subtle. It felt as though the air itself were thinning, depressurizing. It was an odd sensation that made the hair on my arms stand up. Darkness settled fully around us, and before turning in, I walked a few steps from the fire to take in the view one last time. But it was gone. Where the lake had stretched wide and dark only hours earlier, there was now a solid field of white. Inversion had swallowed it whole. The fog didn't roll in like weather usually does. It rose, slowly and steadily filling the valley from the bottom up. The shoreline had disappeared first, then the trees along the lower slopes. Thin tendrils of vapor climbed higher along the tree line, curling upward in faint skeletal fingers. The air around us remained clear. The stars above were sharp and distant, but there was no wind and no sound from below. Chuck came up beside me and let out a low whistle. Looks like we're camping on an island. That's exactly what it felt like. We went to sleep undisturbed. It was a cold night, but we packed enough layers to stay warm. I woke expecting the sun to be warming the tent, but instead everything inside glowed a dull gray. The nylon above me sagged slightly, slick with condensation. The air felt heavier than it had the night before. I unzipped the tent and was immediately met with dense fog. Not the kind that drifts through a valley in ribbons. This was total. It felt like we'd woken up inside a cloud. Moisture clung to my face the moment I stepped out. I could barely see the outline of Chuck's tent just a few feet away. I called for him and Amy, and their replies sounded strangely muted, absorbed by the thickness in the air. They stepped out slowly, both of them blinking and turning in place, trying to orient themselves. It was equal parts beautiful and unsettling. We decided to wait for the fog to lift before hiking, even if it meant losing daylight. It was simply too dense to navigate without almost certainly drifting off route. We tried to get a fire going, but the wood that had felt dry the night before was damp to the touch. The air was so saturated, it felt like we were trying to ignite water. Eventually we gave up and split a few granola bars while we waited. The fog didn't move or thin. It simply held. Around noon, almost without warning, the light began to change. The gray brightened gradually, and the cloud ceiling above us thinned just enough to reveal a pale blue beyond it. Then the ridgeline cleared in a matter of minutes. When it did, we walked to the edge. Below us, the valley was gone. A sea of clouds stretched in every direction. The lower peaks had vanished. Only one distant summit miles away broke through the surface. Other than that, it was nothing but white. Luckily, we'd packed plenty of food and water, and we had the whole week off. None of us were in a hurry. The summit would still be there tomorrow. We agreed to stay put and enjoy it. Break camp the next morning instead. We'd have to adjust the route, maybe cut out the last peak, but no one seemed to mind. The rest of the afternoon passed easily. We played cards on the flat rock beside the tents. We listened to music through a small speaker. Every so often we'd wander to the edge and stare out at the white expanse below. It almost felt like it was moving. Not drifting or rolling, but shifting in place. Like a calm ocean swell, slow and rhythmic, just barely enough to register if you looked long enough. It didn't belong here. As the sun began to sink again, the temperature dropped faster than it had the night before. It wasn't until night fully settled, when the stars were sharp above us and the cloud sea below had turned to ink, that we realized something was wrong. At first it was just a faint glow, far below, but then it moved. Amy noticed it first. She didn't say anything dramatic, just, "What's that?" At first I thought it was a helicopter running low along the valley, maybe skimming just beneath the cloud deck. The light was faint at the edge of white, moving laterally. But helicopters don't move like that. It would stop entirely, hover in place for several long seconds, then reverse direction without widening its arc. It was also slow, and there was no sound. It was just a steady light. Then it dipped downward, the glow thinning as it sank back into the cloud layer, fading until it was gone. Chuck was already pulling out his phone, muttering that it had to be a UFO. He couldn't get the camera to focus through the low light. I thought it was ball lightning, a rare electrical phenomenon trapped in the inversion, something explainable. But it didn't move like weather. It resurfaced minutes later, farther to the left. The glow strengthened as it rose toward the top of the clouds, just shy of breaking through. It paced back and forth along an invisible boundary, before sinking again. I glanced at Amy and saw the same tightness in her jaw that I felt in mine. Whatever it was, it should have been fascinating, beautiful even, but instead it felt wrong in a way that settled low in my stomach. We didn't see the light again that night. Eventually we crawled into our tents, anxious and unsettled in a way none of us wanted to articulate. The next morning, I woke up to the fog again. Visibility was almost non-existent. We weren't willing to waste another day waiting it out. The plan had already shifted once, so we decided to move, slowly and carefully, so that we could finish the hike and drop below the ridgeline without losing each other. We broke camp and packed in silence. We agreed to stay within arm's reach, even for something as simple as stepping off trail. The climb toward the summit was slow. The trail markers were there, but we didn't see them until we were nearly touching them. The world existed in fragments. When we finally reached the summit, it felt like surfacing from underwater. The fog lay beneath us darker than the day before, like a flattened ocean, stretching in every direction. The sky above was overcast, only a bit darker than the sea of clouds below. We stood on that narrow strip of scree between two layers of gray. That's when we saw the light again. It was moving below, pacing the cloud surface exactly as it had the night before. It felt somehow stranger, seeing it in daylight. It hovered slowly. Then it stopped. It was just a light, a distant glow suspended in vapor. But when it stopped, something in my chest tightened. It wasn't scanning anymore. It was looking at something. And somehow, something inside me knew it was looking at us. Then it began moving again, this time toward the peak, where we stood. It moved so slowly, you could almost convince yourself it wasn't moving at all. The distance between us and it seemed unchanged, until it wasn't. None of us spoke. Right before it got close enough to draw alarm, it dipped back down and vanished. Chuck let out a sudden sharp laugh that made Amy and I jump. He was exhilarated, blown away by what we just saw. We were too, just in a different way. The conditions didn't let up through the day. The cold was steady, and the air was dense. As we descended, the landscape shifted. The exposed scree gave way to scattered pines, their trunks emerging from the mist like dark spires. The trail narrowed into a series of switchbacks, cutting through the trees. We were still completely inside the cloud. There was no horizon, no depth, just layers of gray broken by the vertical lines of trunks disappearing into nothing above us. I felt disoriented. I hadn't slept well the night before. I'd woken more than once to flashes behind my eyelids. Phantom light, like when you try to sleep in a moving car, and the sun flickers through passing trees. Even now, walking through the fog, it felt similar. Light where there shouldn't be light. Shapes forming and dissolving at the edge of vision. I slowed my pace, glancing back often. Through the haze, I could make out the silhouettes of Amy and Chuck trailing behind me. Their outlines would blur, vanish, then reappear a few steps later. Every time they faded, my pulse quickened. I'd wait until they were close again before moving on. The fog swallowed sound. Even our boots against gravel seemed muted. Then something flickered at the edge of my vision. A brief glow. I stopped immediately and turned. There was nothing there. Everything was just gray. Amy's voice came from somewhere behind me, tighter than before. She asked if I saw it too. I told her I had. This time it wasn't out over the valley. It was deeper in the trees. A dim glow, threading laterally through the fog, maybe 30 yards downslope. It didn't cast light, illuminating bark or branches. It simply moved, weaving through trunks before dissolving into gray. We kept moving. But this time we picked up our pace. Not running, but no longer casual. The switchbacks shortened as we descended. The trees grew denser, and the fog settled low, pooling between trunks and filling the spaces beneath the canopy. I glanced back again. The glow reappeared higher up on the slope, roughly where we had just been. It didn't follow the trail, but it tracked our direction. It would surface briefly between trees, then slide behind a trunk and vanish. When it appeared again, it would be offset slightly, never in the same place twice. It wasn't pacing in straight lines anymore. It was adjusting. Each time one of us slowed to get a better look, it slipped out of sight, always at the edge of our vision, like something using the terrain for cover. The air grew warmer as we dropped elevation, but thicker. My head felt light. The fog seemed to press inward rather than drift. Then it appeared again, closer than before, but only for a second. A brighter flicker between two trunks, then gone. It was maintaining distance. That's what unsettled me the most. My calves were tight from the descent. Gravel slid underfoot. No one said anything for a while. There didn't seem to be anything useful to say. The trees began to space out, and the air shifted. It felt cooler on my face. And then, just as sudden as it had appeared, the fog wasn't there anymore. There wasn't a dramatic break in it. It just stopped. One step in gray, the next step in clear air. I could see the slope below us. I could see depth again. We turned and looked back up. The cloud layer hung above like something out of a dream. From below, it looked thicker than it had from inside it, even heavier. And there was no sign of movement. The light was gone. Just a lid of gray covering the ridge. We stood a moment, then kept going. The rest of the hike felt normal. Roots and pine needles. We even got the occasional patch of sun. By the time we reached the parking lot, it felt like a different day entirely. I remember loading my pack into the car and looking back at the peaks. The cloud cover hadn't lifted from the upper elevations. It was still settled up there. I lived in a moving home about an hour up into the mountains, just outside Idaho Springs. It wasn't anything special, but that was never the point. I hadn't moved there to linger indoors. I spent the warm months hiking 14ers, and my winters cross-country skiing and snowshoeing through silent drifts. I had a base camp, that's all that mattered. When I was home, I passed the evenings with true crime podcasts and ghost stories. In my opinion, it at least beat the nomad lifestyle. One night I was working bar back at the dive and overheard some locals talking about Fieler's cabin. One of them mentioned it was haunted. It was an old mining shack perched above town. On a clear day you could barely make it out. Just a brown smear breaking the line of dark pines high on the slope. Idaho Springs is a mining town. There are plenty of places rumored to be haunted. Men died in collapses, in fire-damp explosions. I'd heard of Fieler's cabin before. It was something of a local legend. They say in the late 1800s, a man retreated to that cabin and lost his mind. His manic laughter would ricochet off the cliffs and drift down into the town at night. I can imagine it drove the locals up the wall. The stories shift, as they always do. Some said he struck gold and somehow buried himself alive with it. Others claimed a gang went up there for his fortune and killed him. Every version agrees on one thing, though. Old Fieler was buried somewhere beneath the cabin. The locals were saying a company planned to tear it down and build a lodge there within the year. It was the kind of conversation that ends with, if you want to see it, now's the time. My girlfriend Kate is drawn to the macabre like I am. When I mentioned the cabin, she immediately suggested we hike up and camp beside it. I know to some people that sounds like the opening act of a horror movie, but we didn't believe in ghosts. We were fascinated by history and the darker stories that cling to it. To us, it seemed as good a plan as any. Summer was approaching and the snow was retreating fast in the warm spell. There wasn't a real trail leading up there, so we'd have to bushwhack. It was steep, probably 1,800 feet of elevation over 3 miles. We packed our gear and headed out that weekend. The morning was overcast. The air had a bite to it that felt more like autumn than spring. We're seasoned hikers, so while the incline and lack of trail would slow us, it wouldn't be too difficult. The sun rose on the far side of the ridge, leaving the forest floor cold and blue. We could see our breath in the early light. Pines climbed straight and tall around us. A small herd of elk moved ghost-like through a distant meadow. When the sun finally crested the ridge, we went from rubbing our hands for warmth to shedding jackets under sudden heat. We never had eyes on the cabin. We only knew roughly where it sat, so we assumed we'd have to scout around to find it. By the time we reached the elevation where it should have been, we were breathing hard. I hadn't done a proper incline since fall. Winter had been mostly flat terrain on snowshoes. Different muscles, apparently. The woods were nearly silent, except for a few birds ticking in the evergreens. We still couldn't see the cabin. We must have drifted off course, weaving around boulders and fallen timber. We walked the ridgeline for a while, the trees thinning in places. Eventually, a small glade opened up. In its center sat a stone-lined well. We stepped toward it. The stones were darkened with age, dry and cracked. I dropped a penny in and made a wish. I never heard it strike the bottom. We moved on. It wasn't until late afternoon that we finally spotted the cabin. We were nearly ready to turn back when it emerged between the trees. I almost questioned if it was the right place. The forest swallowed it so completely, I couldn't understand how it was visible from town. Still, this had to be it. We dropped our packs and ate quickly before exploring. I tested the door. It resisted at first, then something metallic snapped and gave way. I had to shoulder it until it opened wide enough for us to slip inside. At one end sat an old stove, eaten through with rust, covered in cobwebs. A spring cot without a mattress slumped in the corner. At its foot rested a heavy wooden chest, locked and too weighty to move. I wondered what lay inside. Fieler's gold, perhaps. We laughed at the thought. A crude wooden shelf ran along the interior walls. Anything of value had long since been taken. Only dust and cobwebs remained. The floor creaked under every shift of weight. On the shaded side of the room, several slats had rotted away, leaving a jagged hole in the boards. I shone my flashlight into it. The darkness beneath was deeper than it should have been. From the outside, the cabin looked flush with the earth, but something hollow clearly yawned below it. I felt a prickle at the base of my neck, staring into that void. I couldn't see a bottom, just blackness swallowing the beam. All told, it was interesting, but the novelty faded quickly. There wasn't much else to discover. We pitched our tents beside the cabin. The evening was quiet. A cool wind threaded through the trees and scraped along the rock face. The cabin answered with a low, tired groan. Our fire snapped and hissed as we cooked ramen and passed a flask of whiskey between us. Through breaks in the clouds, we caught glimpses of stars. Instead of listening to podcasts like we normally would, we decided to tell each other our favorite ghost stories. We aimed our flashlights upward beneath our chins, casting grotesque shadows over our faces. It felt childish and was perfect. I didn't hear a laugh, not the ghostly manic echo of old Fieler. If I'm honest, I was almost disappointed. We turned in early, half drunk and in good spirits. I woke sometime in the night to movement outside my tent. That wasn't unusual. Animals passed through camps all the time. But when I reached for Kate, her sleeping bag was empty. She wasn't there. Maybe she'd stepped outside to pee, but I hadn't heard the zipper or her shifting. Kate had sleepwalked before, though I'd never seen it happen while camping. In that event, I figured I should check if that was the case, before she wandered too far, before she might stumble off a crag in the dark. I slipped on my boots and grabbed my flashlight. I called her name softly. There was no response. I didn't want to startle her. If she was sleepwalking, you're supposed to guide them gently back. I moved quietly through the trees, sweeping the beam across trunks and rock. I heard something from the direction of the cabin. My stomach tightened. I thought of the rusted nails, the loose floorboards. She'd left her boots at the tent. I hurried toward it. The door was still cracked open. Inside was pitch black. I pushed it wider and stepped in. The air felt wrong. It was colder than before, like breathing through damp wool. Every small sound seemed amplified. The creaking of the wood and the faint shift of something unseen. But the room was empty. I swung the light toward the hole in the floor. It seemed darker now than the rest of the cabin, as though the darkness had weight. I called her name. Kate. Softly this time. A long pause. Then from below, something answered. So faint I almost missed it. It said, Kate? It wasn't an echo. It came too late, too strained, as if forced through a narrow throat of stone. The delay made no sense unless there was a cavern beneath us, something vast and open. My head began to ache. The air was sour, and my vision blurred at the edges. I called again, my voice cracking. Nothing came back. That startled me worse than the echo. I stepped backward, away from the hole, and backed into something. Not a wall. My pulse detonated in my ears. I turned. It was Kate. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face. Her mouth was parted. Her eyes didn't meet mine, they simply stared through, unfocused. Dirt coated her feet. Thin cuts etched across the soles. She looked like something that had just crawled out of the earth. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and led her outside, away from the suffocating air of the cabin. She moved easily beside me, pliant and silent. I didn't sleep again. Kate lay in her bag the rest of the night, making sounds underneath her breath at intervals. Short bursts that stopped abruptly. I leaned in closer to listen. It was a laugh that sounded far off and distant, and it didn't sound like hers. December always gives me the shakes, not because of the cold. Toby died in December. Somehow he feels closer when frost clings to everything and icicles dangle like crooked teeth. 3 years ago, Toby and I went on our last climb. It was to be our magnum opus. A steep head wall of ice and snow rose above the ravine. It was broken by dark bands of rock and streaked with spindrift that trailed off the ridge. The sky was dotted by sparse clouds of white. The forecast called for a bluebird that day. The weather was said to be clear, though we knew the mountain would have its own say in the matter. Any sign of the weather turning foul, storm clouds or sudden winds, meant we'd abandon the climb and try again tomorrow. There was always tomorrow after all. That's what Toby used to say. Turns out he was wrong. We'd done our fair share of climbs around Mount Washington, but this was our first time in the Huntington Ravine. We hiked to the base before sunrise and stretched, made coffee and had a large breakfast. We kept eyeing the sky, half expecting a sudden shift, some reason to go home. But the obvious dangers still butted in the back of my mind. The terrain here didn't need weather. The day is a bit of a blur looking back, but I remember I took the lead while Toby followed. We started slow, like we always did. From the floor of the ravine, the gully hadn't looked that steep. Up close, though, it kicked back hard. My calves burned from front pointing. My crampon spikes drove into the wind-packed snow. It felt like holding a calf raise that never ended. I'd climb 10, maybe 15 feet at a time, then pause to breathe and glance back down at Toby. He looked solid, comfortable even. I remember envying that a bit. The light wind was pulling loose snow off the upper face in thin white veils, coating my goggles and helmet in small bursts. Despite the effort, my crampon teeth kept finding purchase. The snow was firm, and my tools set clean with each swing. A dark band of rock jutted out on my right, just a few feet higher. I angled toward it and built a quick anchor. My boots were finally flat instead of pointed into the slope. The relief burned almost as much as the climb. I waited for Toby, breathing heavy and hard. My whole body felt like it was vibrating. A jut of rock stuck out crooked above me, like a dark fang. When I looked down, I saw Toby was struggling now, like his adrenaline had finally worn off, and his body was just catching up. I was taking steady breaths, but the shaking didn't cease. That's when I realized it wasn't me. The vibration deepened beneath my boots, subtle at first, like something shifting far above us. Then came a sound I felt more than heard, a low, hollow whomp, as if the mountain had suddenly released something. I looked up. A thin line etched across the slope above Toby, jagged and sharp, stretching from one wall of the gully to the other. For half a second, nothing moved. Then the entire face began to slide. It didn't roar right away. It sheared loose in a single clean sheet, the snow fracturing along that line and breaking into blocks that shattered as they gained speed. What had looked solid moments before turned fluid, folding over itself and accelerating down the funnel of the gully. "Toby!" I tried to shout, but the sound vanished into the growing rush. The snow came faster than seemed possible, gathering everything in its path, loose powder and chunks of wind-packed slab, debris from the rock bands. The gully narrowed below me. There was nowhere for it to spread but down. The fracture line snapped, and Toby saw it the moment I did. He didn't hesitate. Both tools drove in hard. His hips dropped low, and he widened his stance, front points kicking into the crust. He glanced up at me once. I remember the look on his face. It was devoid of panic. He wasn't even scared, just ready. I think he trusted that it would be okay. But it wasn't. The first wave hit him chest high and swallowed him whole. I barely had time to react before the noise reached me. A deep rolling collapse that filled the gully and turned the air solid. I flattened against the rock, one arm wrapped tight around the anchor, the other tool buried as deep as I could drive it. Snow slammed into my back and shoulders and packed around my legs, shoving at my helmet. It felt less like being buried, and more like being inside something that's alive, like standing in the break of a wave that wouldn't pass. For a few seconds, the world turned white and deafening. The sound wasn't just loud, it pressed in on me, filled my helmet and shook through my ribs. I kept my face down and held on until the force thinned, and the weight lifted. And then it was gone. The silence that followed didn't feel like relief. I cleared my goggles and looked down the gully. It wasn't the same anymore. The run of ice and stone had been packed in by a broad mound of snow, already settling into place. The surface looked smooth from above, almost harmless, like it had always been there. But Toby was gone. There was no rope dangling or his ice pick left behind. The avalanche had wiped any trace of him or his gear clear off the mountain. I don't remember unclipping from the anchor, but I must have. The angle had softened where the debris had piled up. The descent should have been simpler, but it wasn't. I moved too fast, and I slid when I didn't mean to. I overkicked steps and had to catch myself more than once. Every dip in the surface looked like it might be him. Every shadow or fold. I kept telling myself I saw something, but it was only wind moving loose snow across the top. I moved frantically then, knowing every second mattered. By the time I reached the bottom of the debris, my legs were shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the climb. I switched my transceiver to search mode and began pacing the snow mound. The screen stayed blank. There was no signal or flicker as I walked back and forth again and again. There was just nothing. I triggered the SOS on the inReach and stood there, staring at the mound, like it might move if I watched it long enough. I called out his name and began digging with my gloves. Again and again, I called for him, but there was no response. No noise. Eventually, I stripped off my gloves and clawed away at the snow like an animal making a series of small burrows. The wind started to rise before I heard the helicopter. It took close to 3 hours for them to reach us. By then I was still digging, no part of me considering that any chance of finding him alive was already gone. They circled once, then sat down below the ravine. A team came up with probes and began working at the debris and measured lines. They stayed until the light was all but gone. At some point, they pulled me away from the slope and treated me for frostbite. I fought them harder than I should have. The search and rescue team returned the next morning, and the morning after that. They told me the slide had funneled into a terrain trap. The debris could have been 20 feet deep in places. Eventually, they called off the search. They never found him. It's been 4 years since Toby died on the mountain. I've stopped walking in the center of rooms. I stay near the walls. I don't know when that started. When you lose someone close to you, I'm told you start noticing signs. I didn't have to look very hard. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him under the house. It starts as a faint disturbance beneath the floorboards, like something working at the wood from underneath. A dragging pressure, then a quick rake across the grain. When I'm outside, it follows me. Under turf, it's muffled, like fingers tearing at packed soil. On sidewalks, it changes, it's sharper and more brittle. A grinding beneath the concrete, as if whatever's down there keeps hitting something it can't break through. It sounds like someone digging with their bare hands. Sometimes it stops long enough that I think I imagined it, but then it starts again. I'm told it's PTSD, survivor's guilt, that the mind finds ways to replay what it can't undo. That might be true, but the sound isn't a memory. They say the debris could have been 20 feet deep. I try not to picture what that would take to move. But every winter, when the ground hardens and the frost sinks in, I hear him working at it again, like he's still trying to get out.